He thought she couldn't hear him, so he said everything. Every secret. Every lie. Every crime he thought would never leave that room. What he didn't know? The deaf maid standing right behind him was reading every word off his lips. In that moment, without him realizing it, he handed her the evidence to destroy him. And by the time he figured it out, it was already too late. If this is their first time on this channel, they need to subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of story told here. Drop a comment below and tell us where they are watching from. Every city, every country. Let the world see how far this story travels. Now let's take them back to where it all began. Her name was Sera, 26 years old, deaf since birth. 11 months into her position as domestic staff at the Harrington estate, a 70-room mansion on 43 acres behind iron gates that had stood unmoved for 47 years. To the Harrington household, Sera was invisible in the most complete sense of the word. Not disliked, not resented, simply unregistered. She moved through rooms, and people continued their conversations without lowering their voices, without choosing their words, without any of the social adjustments human beings make when they believe they are being observed. They spoke around her the way people speak in empty rooms. Freely, carelessly, completely. And that, right there, was the crack in the foundation of everything that would later come crashing down. What none of them had bothered to discover was that Sera read lips with an accuracy that would have stopped every conversation in that house dead if anyone had known. 26 years of navigating a world built for hearing people had sharpened something in her that most people never develop. A capacity to read the precise language of faces. The tension in a jaw. The micro-expression around eyes that appear calm. The shape a mouth makes when it is telling the truth versus constructing something designed to sound like it. When a person cannot rely on sound, everything else becomes signal. And Sera received every signal in that house with complete clarity. She noticed the way Ms. Valles, the head housekeeper, 11 years with the family, composed as stone in every public moment, went physically smaller whenever Dominic Harrington entered a room. Not the smallness of deference. The smallness of someone who had learned, through experience, that taking up less space was safer. She noticed how the gardening staff added unnecessary distance to their daily routes, looping wide around the east wing of the property, spending 10 extra minutes every morning to avoid a particular corridor. She noticed that in 11 months of employment, 3 different maids had disappeared from the estate without farewell. No notice, no goodbye, rooms empty, names unspoken, as though the house itself had quietly absorbed them and moved on. She filed all of it. Every observation. Every anomaly, every small wrong note in the daily performance of normalcy that the Harrington household put on. She filed it without knowing yet what she was collecting it for. But she stayed. She stayed because her younger brother Kofi was 17 months into treatment for a kidney condition that consumed every financial resource she could direct toward it. The Harrington position paid nearly twice what anything else had offered. The live-in arrangement meant almost her full salary could go home to him every month without exception. She needed this job the way people need air, not dramatically, but absolutely. So she kept her head down. She kept her eyes quiet. She moved through that house like the ghost they believed her to be. And she waited, without knowing she was waiting, for the moment that would make leaving not just inevitable, but necessary. The Harrington name, by every public measure, represented something aspirational. Elliot Harrington Sr. had constructed his fortune over 30 years through private infrastructure, government contracts, and real estate development executed at a scale that made his name synonymous with permanence in the city. 3 hospitals bore it. 2 university buildings carried it on their facades. A government complex had been dedicated in a ceremony attended by people whose own names carried enormous weight. He had a foundation. He had a legacy. He had the specific quality of wealth that stops resembling money and begins resembling geography, simply part of the landscape, assumed to have always been there, assumed to always remain. And then there was his son. Dominic Harrington at 29 was everything a dynasty could want on paper and everything a dynasty should fear in reality. Educated at elite institutions. Sharp in business, genuinely, dangerously sharp. Running 3 major divisions of his father's company by 27 with results that silenced anyone who suspected nepotism. Charming at public events. Photogenic at the charity functions that kept the family's image polished. Behind the walls of the estate, He was something no press release had ever described. The staff understood it collectively, the way domestic workers always come to understand the true character of the people they serve, through accumulated daily proximity that strips away every performance. They understood it through the quality of silences that fell when he entered rooms, through the way certain requests were phrased as choices when they were not choices at all, through the speed with which they all learned, at different times and through different moments, that the Harrington household operated by a single governing principle. What happened inside those walls stayed inside those walls. New staff absorbed this understanding within weeks, usually through a look from someone more experienced, sometimes through a quiet word near the service entrance, delivered without drama but with absolute seriousness. Nobody had delivered that word to Sera. Nobody had considered it necessary. She was the deaf maid. What could she possibly overhear? It was a Thursday night in late October. Dominic was in his private study, a room Sera had been told was empty that evening, cleared after a gathering, ready for collection. The Persian rug was thick enough to swallow every footstep. She entered without knocking, moved along the far wall, began setting crystal glasses onto her tray. He was at the window, back to the room, phone at his ear, pacing with the loose, unhurried energy of a man completely at ease with whatever he was discussing. He did not hear her enter. She could not hear him speaking. But the window before him was black with night, and in that blackness it held a perfect reflection. And in that reflection, Sera could see his face turned just enough, his jaw, his mouth, the particular deliberate movement of someone mid-conversation. She read every single word. He was discussing a woman, a worker who had filed a formal complaint. He told the person on the other end, a man he called Marcus, that the documents supporting her claim had already been destroyed. He spoke about a settlement being prepared, something she would be offered before she found proper legal counsel, something she would accept because in his assessment people in her situation always accepted the money because they had no framework to imagine doing otherwise. He mentioned, with a casualness that was more chilling than anger would have been, that this had been managed before. The same method, the same outcome, that the lawyers understood their role and there would be no complications. Then he laughed. It was not a villain's laugh. It was not theatrical or cruel. It was relaxed. The laugh of a man running a calculation he had run many times before and trusted completely. The laugh of someone for whom the word consequence had simply never applied in the way it applied to everyone else. Sera placed the last glass on the tray. She walked out of the room. Dominic never turned. He finished his call, poured a drink, and retired for the evening without a single thought directed toward the deaf maid who had been present for all of it. Why would he think of her? She couldn't hear a word he said. He was right. He had simply never considered that hearing was not the only way to listen, and in 29 years of being protected by his family's power, nobody had ever forced him to consider it. That oversight was about to cost him everything he had. 4 days later, Sera was called to the housekeeper's office and handed a sealed envelope. Termination, effective immediately. Reason, unauthorized entry into a private room. She stood in the car park holding that envelope in the cold morning air for a long time. She held it the way a person holds something they expected and still somehow hoped wouldn't arrive. That night, she typed everything to her brother Kofi. She had always preferred typing, cleaner, more precise, no possibility of misinterpretation. He read it and responded within minutes. What are you going to do? She sat with that question for a long time. The sensible answer, the protective answer, the answer that every rational voice inside her was quietly offering, was to find another position. Absorb the injustice the way she had absorbed so many others. Guard herself and Kofi and allow powerful people to continue being powerful, because that was the architecture of the world and one person could not redesign it alone. But she kept returning to the laugh. That easy, unhurried, bottomless laugh. She thought about the woman on the phone who was about to be handed a document she didn't fully understand, for a claim that had already been deliberately gutted, who would never know that the evidence protecting her had been destroyed by design. She thought about the 3 maids who left overnight, about the flinch on Ms. Valles's face, about 11 months of accumulated observations that she had been collecting without fully understanding what they formed until now. She typed back 2 words. Fix it. She began with what she had. The name Marcus. The phrase handled the last one, and a pattern she had already begun to recognize before the termination letter arrived. She pulled every available public record connected to Harrington Industries' employment disputes. Most were sealed, but 3 had progressed far enough to appear in court filings before being withdrawn, all within a 4-year window, all involving estate or on-site workers, all aimed at the same point in the process, as though someone had reached in and simply switched them off. She mapped the timeline, identified the legal firms involved, cross-referenced the dates against staff departures she could verify through the worker community network she had been part of since her 3rd month at the estate. Then she reached out, carefully, patiently, without accusation or urgency. She asked questions and made clear that no response was required. 3 people answered. The first had relocated to another city and would not give details. But in a single message she told Sera, "You are not the first one who noticed. You are just the first one who looked." The second was a former groundskeeper named Tund who met her in a public location of his choosing and brought a USB drive containing photographs he had taken secretly on his personal phone. Images of a vehicle reported stolen and then quietly recovered and repaired before police inspection could occur, connected to an incident that had never been formally explained. The third was a former accounts assistant named Patricia who had spent 2 years processing off-book payments from a subsidiary account controlled personally by Dominic. She had kept printed and digital copies of everything, stored in separate locations. She had kept them, she said, because she always believed someone would eventually come looking. She had simply been waiting. The first person to fully commit alongside Sera was Grace, a civil rights advocate and paralegal who had spent 2 years attempting to build a legal case against Harrington Industries before being outmaneuvered at every turn by a legal team that operated with the precision of people who had done this many times before. When Grace received Tund's photographs and Patricia's financial records, she was silent for a long moment on the call. Then she said, "Tell me everything from the beginning. Leave nothing out." Through Grace came Callum, a retired investigative journalist who had held a verified, fully researched piece on Harrington labor practices for 14 months, unable to publish without a primary source willing to go on record. Through Callum came Jay, a methodical young tech specialist who encrypted, timestamped, and distributed all collected evidence across multiple secure platforms in multiple geographic locations, working by a single principle. By the time anyone comes looking for this material, it will exist in places they cannot reach. And then, arriving at her own initiative, through the staff network, in a single direct message, "Ms. Velez, I know what is being done. I have been waiting 3 years for someone to do it. Tell me what is needed." She brought 37 months of personal documentation, internal complaints filed and subsequently erased, communications carefully retained, a handwritten diary maintained not because she believed it would ever be used, but because recording the truth had been the only way she preserved her own clarity through years of watching it be suppressed. 7 people, vastly different circumstances, all with real things to lose, all choosing, with full knowledge of the risk, to lose them. Around week 3, Dominic's network flagged activity. He was careful enough to have people watching for exactly this kind of movement, and careful enough to respond to it without appearing to respond. Grace received correspondence suggesting a licensing review of unrelated credentials. Callum's publication lost a significant advertiser without explanation or notice. Tund found a fabricated violation notice on his vehicle near his home address, a location that had never been connected to him publicly. Small, targeted, untraceable pressure. Designed not to destroy, but to frighten. To produce the particular kind of fear that makes people quietly decide that their own safety is worth more than whatever they were pursuing. It did not produce fear. It produced confirmation. Because the nature of that pressure told Sera's network exactly what they needed to know, that Dominic had identified the threat, was taking it seriously enough to respond, and was still operating under the assumption that intimidation would work. He was watching every door they might walk through. He had not considered that they had already moved through the walls. The night before everything broke open, Sera sat at her laptop at 2:17 in the morning and executed 3 actions. She sent encrypted evidence packages to 6 individuals, 2 of whom she had never spoken with directly, with standing instructions that any harm to any member of their group would trigger immediate distribution to 31 journalists operating across 9 countries. She submitted a formal federal labor complaint, supported by Patricia's certified financial documentation and tons photographic evidence, filed through Grace's legal representation with full supporting affidavits. And she recorded a video, seated straight, facing the camera, completely composed, in which she delivered in precise sign language a full account of everything she had witnessed in Dominic Harrington's study on that Thursday night in October. Grace provided certified verbal translation in real time beside her. The video was uploaded to one server, copied immediately to 4 more, then placed in the custody of 3 separate individuals with a single instruction. If contact was not received by morning, release everything. Sera closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet of her small rented room and understood something clearly for the first time in months. The truth was no longer hers alone to carry. It was already everywhere, and no amount of money, legal maneuvering, or carefully applied pressure could collect it back. It happened on a Tuesday. The federal complaint entered public record just after 9 in the morning. Callum's piece went live 30 minutes later, meticulously sourced, 3 named witnesses, Ms. Valles's account given publicly for the first time in 11 years of service to the family. The video moved first through the networks that powerful people historically never monitor: domestic worker communities, labor advocacy groups, the quiet connected spaces where people discarded by wealth share information. Then it accelerated. Then it became a current too strong to redirect. By midday, it had broken into mainstream coverage. By early afternoon, Harrington Industries stock had dropped sharply. By evening, 3 board members had issued carefully distanced personal statements. 2 of the women who had accepted settlements, the ones Dominic had been completely certain would remain silent forever, came forward publicly, their agreements voided by the evidence now in federal possession. At just after 7 in the evening, federal vehicles arrived at the Harrington estate. The iron gates, the ones that had stood for 47 years without ever being forced, opened by federal authority. And Dominic Harrington was walked from his own front door, across his own marble floors, through his own entrance hall, into the back of a government vehicle. His father stood at the top of the staircase. 2 lines of tears ran down a face that had spent decades learning to show nothing. Not for his son, really. For the truth he had always carried privately, that the family kept secrets that would one day demand their payment in full. He had simply never imagined who would arrive to collect them. The aftermath arrived the way aftermath always does, not as a single moment, but as a slow, irreversible unraveling. 3 separate legal proceedings were opened against Dominic Harrington. Harrington Industries entered a period its own internal communications described, in a leaked memo, as existential. The family name began its quiet withdrawal from the buildings and institutions that had displayed it for decades, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the steady, unargued logic of tide going permanently out. Elliot Harrington Sr. stepped back from public life without announcement. He simply stopped appearing. And Sera went home. Not to the estate. Not to the rented room with the corkboard and the late nights and the encrypted files and the weight of everything she had been carrying. Home. To Kofi. To the apartment with thin walls and secondhand furniture and the window that let in too much cold air in October. He was at the kitchen table when she walked in. He stood the moment he saw her face. She signed one thing. It's done. He held her hand and asked nothing further, because the details could wait, and what mattered was that she was there, and whole, and finished with the hardest thing she had ever done. In that small apartment, in that quiet that belonged entirely to them, Sera sat with her brother and let herself rest. Dominic Harrington made one mistake. He looked at Sera and saw nothing worth accounting for. He saw a deaf maid in a gray uniform moving through his home, and his mind completed the rest of the sentence the way powerful people always complete sentences about people they consider beneath them, with absence, with irrelevance, with the comfortable assumption that invisibility and powerlessness are the same thing. They are not. They have never been. Because the most precise observers in any room are always the ones nobody is performing for. The ones who have spent their entire lives developing alternative languages for a world that was not built with them in mind. The ones who read faces when they cannot read voices. Who watch hands when they cannot watch expressions. Who notice everything because they were never given the luxury of noticing selectively. Dominic built his protection from noise, lawyers, pressure, money, influence, The overwhelming volume of power applied in the right directions at the right moments. Sera dismantled it in silence. With nothing more than the truth, placed carefully in the right hands, at the right time, in enough locations that no amount of power could gather it back. He thought her silence was his advantage. It was his ending. He thought she couldn't speak, but she made the whole world listen. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if they haven't already. And drop a comment below telling us where they are watching from, because stories like this one deserve to travel further than the people who tried to bury them ever imagined possible. See you in the next one.